Hello, everyone. This is Lisa Andrews at AWS Truepower. I'd like to thank you for joining us and welcome you to today's webinar to learn more about wind and solar project due diligence and the risks that can make or break a renewable energy project. Presenting today will be Josh Kunkel, Business Development Manager for our Investor Services Group, and Brian Kramack, Senior Project Manager with AWS Truepower. So just a couple of quick things to note before we begin. The webinar is going to be in listen-only mode, but we will try to answer some questions at the end of the webinar if we have time. So you can go ahead and enter your questions into the questions box on your interface. Also, we're recording today's webinar, and we will make that available and a copy of the presentation slides available, and so we will email you those, or we'll email you when they are available. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Josh Kunkel to get started.
Great. Thanks, Lisa, and thank you all for taking the time to listen in today. So one of the industry hot topics for renewable energy today is how projects are financed and what differentiates between a project that gets built and a project that stalls. Lying at the center of this crossroad is oftentimes the findings of the due diligence report conducted by an independent engineer before or during the financing period. Now, while energy estimates are crucial to the perceived viability of the project, there are also a variety of factors that contribute to whether or not the project gets financed. Today we are hoping to provide some insight into this topic and highlight some of the crucial pieces that every project should have in order to move forward in an efficient and profitable manner. So first we want to give a brief overview of AWS Truepower. AWS was founded in 1983, giving us nearly 30 years of experience in the rather young industry of renewable energy. We offer a broad range of services that support the life cycle of both wind and solar projects. And to date, we've provided services on over 60,000 megawatts in over 80 different countries. We are headquartered right now in Albany, New York, and we are a global operation. We have offices in Barcelona and Bangalore, India. So there are a few reasons why we decided the timing was appropriate to have this discussion on technical due diligence. The first is that mergers and acquisitions are at a 2-year high for both the wind and solar industries. You can tell here by the charts that the activity has picked up drastically in the last quarter. Obviously, when you look at potential M&A deals, a thorough due diligence review is critical to making a smart investment or purchase. The second is that with the expiration of the PTC, or production tax credit, at the end of this year for wind farms, there's a big push to get these farms up and operational. This means they need to be financed and constructed without any hitches to meet the tight deadline. Hiring an experienced IE can help make sure that no glitches arise during this critical construction period. So with that as a backdrop, let's take a quick look at what we're going to touch on today. First, we will give a brief overview of due diligence, and then we'll look at some project killers or fatal flaws we've seen in the industry. Then Brian is going to talk about operational wind and solar farms and how they are evaluated from a due diligence standpoint, and then we'll take a look at some case studies. So a quick definition of due diligence. Due diligence is simply an investigation into the viability of a potential project investment. It occurs in some form before every investment or major decision, whether it's investing in a large solar farm or simply buying a new car. It's gathering all the facts and leaving no stone unturned before deciding to move forward. For larger deals, such as renewable energy projects, the due diligence effort is much more comprehensive, and various experts are brought in to assist in the different aspects of the project. Our area of expertise here at AWS Truepower lies in the technical due diligence. And that's what we'll be focusing on for the rest of the presentation. So as we look at when due diligence is conducted for major energy projects, it generally occurs right before the financial close. This is similar to most, if not every, financial transaction. A financial transaction for wind or solar can happen at any point during the life of the project, whether it's a construction loan, a full-term loan, a refinancing of an operational project, or an acquisition. After the buyer and seller come together in principle on the terms of the arrangement, an independent engineer is brought in to assess the project. The findings from this IE report or due diligence report is then used in the final negotiations to iron out any differences that might remain. So when the IE begins to take a look at a project, some very basic high-level questions are asked. These questions are used to dig down into the minutiae of the project and predict how healthy it will be moving forward. Some of these basic questions included are centered around profitability, cost, schedule, and technical feasibility. The more questions that are answered as yes, the safer the potential investment. So as we evaluate the project in terms of answering those basic questions, there are some common technical risks with renewable energy projects that are important to evaluate. The first is the resource. Will the wind blow or sun shine the way they say it will? This is obviously a big factor in the future energy productions, which is the basis for future revenue. It's important to evaluate the siting of the project. Where is it located? Is the project accessible for construction and maintenance? What is the terrain like? And how has the on-site data been collected? The technology should also be evaluated thoroughly. Is it a new technology? Is the technology the right choice for the environment it's in? How is the technology maintained? The design of the entire plant is then looked at very closely. How has the design been optimized? Is it the most efficient design for that area and this technology? Contracts involved on the project are obviously very important for risk mitigation and its overall success. The IE will take a look and evaluate the PPA, the warranty and supply agreement, the EPC agreement, and any other important agreements. And just to clarify, we do not comment on the legality of these contracts. This is all done from a technical standpoint, and we primarily look to make sure they support the estimated energy production. We'll then take a look at the schedule, and we'll evaluate it to make sure that it's being met and that it's realistic. And then finally, we'll take a look to make sure you have all the necessary permits and that all the environmental regulations are met. So these IE reports are obviously very thorough, which means the scope of work can be quite extensive. Typically, we recommend to start off with a fatal flaw review. That is, we go into the data room and do a high-level look to identify any high-risk areas or red flags that exist in the project or plant. Many times, major project killers can be identified up front, and then they are relayed back to the appropriate parties and they can decide the best path forward. Hopefully, no red flags are identified and we can dive into the rest of the scope of work. We will stress this. It's important that if you are a developer or owner that you are confident that the scope of work the IE is performing is acceptable to the bank that you are working with. Most times the banks will have a say in who does the IE work, but oftentimes, at least here in the US, it's the developer or owner that ends up cutting the check. So make sure you've done your own due diligence when choosing a consultant and make sure they are credible and accepted by your bank. That's why here at AWS Truepower, making sure our scope of work is approved by the major financial institution has always been a priority for us. And we've worked with several of the banks to refine the scope of work over the past year to ensure we're meeting their needs. We often will also partner with highly credible engineering firms to lend their expertise with the civil and electrical aspects of the IE report. And this has worked quite well for us on past projects. It allows both AWS Truepower and our engineering partner to focus on our areas of expertise with a scope of work that's been pre-approved by the banks, and then we deliver a final, comprehensive, bankable report at the end of the project. So we understand that the developers and owners are never overjoyed at having to incur the extra cost of hiring an IE, and they'd much rather the bank take their project at face value. However, because we have years of experience looking across hundreds of projects, we know exactly what to look for and where to look. Sometimes red flags aren't always as obvious to the untrained eye. Some of the dangers of not conducting a thorough review are listed here, and obviously there are some very central themes. You need to meet your schedule, you need to keep your costs down, it's important you receive the appropriate financing structure, and that you can generate balanced returns. Conducting a thorough review early with a credible partner will help ensure these dangers listed are avoided. So let's look at some red flags, some fatal flaws, and then hopefully we can provide some ways in how you can avoid them. Typically, when we look at the project and make sure it's staying within its budget, there are two stages that we look at, the operational period and the construction phase. Both have separate types of budgets, but both are critical to stay within. Staying within the budget when the plant is operating means ensuring that the energy and resource have been accurately modeled and that the O&M expenses are budgeted for appropriately. Underperformance or going over on O&M expenditures means that you are likely going to overextend your budget. Taking a look at the construction or pre-construction phase, one of the important things to look at is the relationship and track record of the EPC. We want to make sure that the scope as proposed by the EPC is appropriate for the project and up to par with industry standards and other like projects. Mainly, we want to make sure the cost projections are reasonable and sustainable for the construction period. If the EPC went in low at a low cost to win the bid, it's our job to make sure that that cost can be met. Otherwise, any change orders for additional expenses are going to put your budget at risk. Of course, we evaluate the major contracts that are imperative to hitting your budget, including the interconnection agreement, the PPA, and the supply agreements and make sure that they are appropriate both with the specific project but also with the current market. Using a newer technology can also have a significant impact on the budget. With a new technology, it's important to evaluate the track record of the manufacturer and make sure that the owner can stay within the O&M budget. Oftentimes, new technologies will require a higher O&M cost or maintenance reserve, and we'll get into this a little bit later. A strong focus of ours here at AWS Truepower is the accuracy of the energy numbers. Having an accurate energy number is critical to the future health of the project, and likewise, inflated energy numbers can very negatively affect future returns. There are many factors that play into obtaining an accurate energy number, and we listed a few of the major ones here. One, we will always want to look at the on-site data within its given measurement period and see how representative it is with the long-term resource. So, for example, if you have a year of data, how does that data look against the resource for the past 10 to 15 years in that area? If it happens to be a windy year or a below average year, it's important to correct that using the long-term resource data from nearby meteorological stations. Energy losses are also a very important factor. Any losses that are applied to the gross energy number should be validated where possible. If data can be supplied to help justify these losses, that's always the best case scenario. For example, if the developer has data showing the availability of a similar wind farm using similar models in a similar environment, we can take that into account when assessing the availability of the new project. If no data is available, it's important to understand how and why losses are applied. When looking at this process, we have the advantage of looking over 30 gigawatts worth of past experience, so we're very technical in our application of different losses. If we see a project that is not taken into account critical losses or has applied losses in areas where it's unnecessary, that for us is certainly a red flag. This will affect the projected capacity factor of the plant and in turn the size of the debt secured and the financial health of the plant moving forward. Likewise, reducing the uncertainty of the resource and energy production can be very beneficial to the owner. A lengthy and well-designed measurement period, data to back up losses, and choosing the right site for the project are all ways to minimize uncertainty, which can have an impact on the size of the debt secured. For example, if we look at a project that's financed off of a P90 value, depending on the coverage ratio, a 2 to 3% increase in the size of the debt is possible by reducing the uncertainty a few percentage points. It may not seem like a lot, but at the large scale of these projects, this is in the order of millions of dollars. Obviously, a big thing that we look for, and therefore a big thing that the banks look for, is that you have all the required contracts and that they are appropriate for the size of the project, the technology implemented, and the current market. If any of these are missing or conflicting, or simply just not as strong as they should be, this can be a red flag. Schedule is a huge factor in pre-construction projects. Failure to obtain correct permitting or address any issues in the community can result in lengthy delays. Unfortunately, the timing of these items can be out of your control, such as waiting for a permit to come through. We've seen what we thought was a 2-week delay waiting for a permit to come through turn into a 3-month delay. So it's best to deal with these issues up front and as early as possible. Perhaps even more critical for this year is the schedule for the construction of wind projects that are trying to take advantage of the PTC or production tax credit. Because it expires at the end of this year, if your project isn't operational, however that's defined by your tax lawyer, by December 31st, it could cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars and could potentially stall or kill a project. So we mentioned earlier the importance of understanding what permits are needed and the timing of obtaining these permits and identifying all of this as early as possible. It's also important to keep these readily available and easy to find in the data room. Keeping an organized and complete data room is important in presenting your project as a complete, comprehensive, and valuable package. If documents are missing or if there are any unanswered questions, this could lead to delays, a lower valuation, or potentially to walkaways. Likewise, we talked a little bit about new technology risk earlier, but we will say this, new technology and advancements in technology are a very good thing for our industry. They can increase performance and they allow renewable energy to compete with traditional methods of energy generation. However, until the technology becomes proven, new technology is considered higher risk technology. But there are ways to mitigate for these risks and to be able to benefit from the advantage of technological advancements. So how do we mitigate for these risks? The first is we'll take a look at the history of the company. If the company has a long, outstanding track record, it generally will help lower the risk of the new technology, simply because they likely understand how to maintain and care for the new products. We'll take a look at the past and present models of the technology and see if the current model is an evolution, which is lower risk, or a complete revolution, which might be a higher risk. Then we take a look at the record of the technology itself. How many have been installed? What does the warranty look like? And how has the technology been maintained? And what is the O&M plan moving forward? A very good way to mitigate for newer technology is through strong contract provisions. The more willing the manufacturer is to take some of that risk with you on the new technology, the more willing lenders will be willing to take that risk with you as well. So obviously the bottom line for every project is how profitable the project is. All of the risks discussed earlier play into the project's bottom line. There are a few points here that we want to touch on, the first being resource. Because resource is your fuel, it drastically affects the revenue stream. Depending on the capital structure, we've seen that a 5% missed resource can result in 30 to 40% decrease in dividend payments. In fact, oftentimes, if the plant's production is not meeting a certain level of expectation, the lending institution, in order to mitigate for their risk, may implement a cash sweep. This means that all revenue for a certain period of time that may have previously gone to the owner is now used to pay off the debt. This is something that is negotiated up front, so make sure you're confident that you can hit your energy and revenue numbers. No one likes missing out on payments. Another scenario is that if the project is unable to pay the debt as agreed for a certain period, you may need to dip into the reserves to cover these payments. This obviously is not a good scenario, and it means that future revenue will be needed to replenish these reserves. Ultimately, if the project is struggling and can't get on the right track, it may need to be refinanced using less favorable terms or even sold at a much lower valuation. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Brian Kramak, and he is going to discuss due diligence for operational assessments and some case studies.
Thanks, Josh. With all the different areas of due diligence mentioned so far, you might ask why the focus on operational assessments. There are a couple of reasons. First, if we go back and look at the initial slide, merger and acquisition activities are up, and they often involve operational as well as greenfield projects. Greenfield projects being projects that are still in development. But also, asset owners are looking for areas to improve revenue. The operational assessment methodology establishes a baseline for the project for its current energy generation capability and also identifies potentially recoverable energy. Where pre-construction estimates focused on model data, operational assessments rely heavily on actual performance records. The behavior of a well-run plant translates to lower uncertainty if you compare it to the uncertainty associated with an average plant. And both of these have lower uncertainty than any estimates that have been put together based on pre-construction methods. And then finally, bundling of projects into portfolios can result in further decreases in uncertainty. We actually have 3 different tools that we use in concert or separately depending on the needs of the review, with operational assessments being the first. This methodology results in a bankable report, an operational energy production report, or we have the acronym OEPR, and that's comparable to our pre-construction report called the energy production report, or EPR. The second tool we have is a variance analysis tool, and this actually relies on SCADA data, 10-minute data, to do a much deeper review of the operational characteristics of the plant. Now, both the operational assessment and the variance analysis are tools that are used on a project-by-project basis. And we make that distinction to separate it from the portfolio assessment. Portfolio assessment, at least as we talk about it today for our definitions, it's establishing the benefit associated with the group of projects together. So it's actually more value than if you consider the projects separately, and it's associated with understanding the uncertainty in those projects and how the uncertainties are related. We'll look at the operational assessments first. The operational assessments rely on monthly data, and it's a relatively simple process. As you can see from this example, for a wind project, correlations are made between the resource and the amount of energy produced after addressing through different methodologies availability, curtailment, the resource availability, and any seasonality associated with the resource. One of the main advantages to this type of analysis is, as it's based on operational data, there's usually a significant improvement in the ratios between the P50, the average production, and that 1-year P99 value that the banks do their financing and debt load capabilities on, or base their debt load capabilities on. I did a look back at some of the EPRs. Again, that's the pre-construction energy production reports that we do, and the average P99 to P50 ratio was about 70%, meaning that there was a reduction about 30% from the P50 for the values that the banks were basing their debt load on. When you look at an operational report, the average for those, at least for the ones we've conducted over the last couple of years, has averaged 80%. So that's about a 10% improvement in this one ratio, which is a key metric in the financing of projects. We mentioned that the methodology is simple, and we actually gave a presentation back in April down at the O&M conference in Dallas, where in a matter of about 20 to 30 minutes, we were able to actually go through and explain almost all aspects of this method so that O&M teams could be doing similar analysis to what we do for bankable reports. The main features of this type of analysis is that we can take the calculational portion of it, and by doing a little bit lighter weight version of the analysis, actually use the same tool to look at the energy generation capabilities of a portfolio of different projects, which is a very cost-effective means of reconciling the energy production for each of those projects individually. And then finally, the cost of this type of assessment is generally about half to two-thirds of the cost of a pre-construction report that relies so heavily on modeled data. We talked about the operational assessment being simple, and it has its counterpart when you need to do a deeper dive in it to gain a better understanding of the performance of a wind farm, and that counterpart is the variance analysis. One of the primary uses for this tool is to establish an understanding in the differences between any pre-construction estimates that might have been done and operational assessments based on newer operational data. It does rely on SCADA data, and once we understand the cause of the loss of data, then we can actually estimate how much of that energy can be recovered. This recovery of energy is often the hidden value in the renewable energy generating facility. And it allows for direct comparisons between the different estimates. It allows a means to triangulate and understand why there are gaps between the different methodologies. From our assessments of individual farms, we have one additional tool that's actually received quite a bit more focus. The increase in M&A activities that we talked about at the beginning has resulted in an increase in interest of understanding the benefits associated with portfolios of projects. This methodology was conceptually introduced globally back in 2004, and AWS has been doing these types of assessments since 2007. This type of analysis is considered in financing when determining the debt load capability of the portfolio. When you consider the pieces individually, then you can actually establish a benefit from them by understanding the correlations between the uncertainties, and you can remove some of the risk by understanding to what degree those uncertainties are correlated. And that tool is used, and we're going to talk about it when we talk about our case studies in a couple more slides for project financing, for reducing banks' risk, and also for increasing the debt load capability. So with that, we'll talk about some of the case studies that we have that are very good examples of due diligence projects that AWS has conducted. With this first project, it was a very large, almost $1 billion project on the West Coast. And here, even though the scope was traditional, we were validating the energy estimates and preparing our own independent estimates, which you have to realize that once projects are measured in billions of dollars, that any risk, the actual dollar value of that risk goes up with the project value. So a risk that could be assessed at 5%, and for $1 billion project would be $50 million, would only have been a $5 million risk for a $100 million project. That's $45 million more that's going to come out of somebody's pocket during the process of this project. It's risk that's not mitigated that has to be addressed. The second example in our portfolio even though we've talked so much about the importance of energy, are the technical aspects of the projects. In this case, again, this was a wind project. There was a known fleet-wide issue associated with the blades of the wind turbines that were being used, and we were able to confirm for the prospective owner that indeed that issue had been addressed and mitigated. For the owner and for the financing, this freed up a significant amount of money that was being set aside as a reserve to deal with unknown issues because of this issue with the blades. And again, it's not all about wind. As you saw from the mergers and acquisitions slide, there's actually more activity going on in the solar. And just last year we did an evaluation, again on the energy generation capability of the project for a family of solar projects. Portfolios are a prime area of additional work. Talking about portfolios, recently we completed a project for Duke that involved 5 different projects. And in this case, the portfolio benefit did play a key role. We were able to establish the value of the portfolio benefit, and this was used to allow a higher debt load than allowed by considering the projects individually. Here's some of the names of the banks that were involved. And as we're on the topic of portfolios, separate from any of the projects we've mentioned so far, I've got a tale of 2 different ones from some projects in the past. Now, this is a tale of 2 portfolios, and again, they're not for our case studies, but they're worth noting, and you'll see as we tie up in our summary why they're so important. In the first project, this was an international project that started a while back, and it actually started and they did their due diligence in a stepped manner. They began very early in the process, and that allowed us to look at the energy generation capabilities of the project, and we established the value of the portfolio and actually a gap between the value of the energy generation capabilities and the value that was being asked for by the seller. The value gap was almost $20 million. Now, because we had started very early, we were able to develop a compensation plan that all parties agreed to. The seller was able to actually continue and ask the selling price, and yet the buyer had a compensation mechanism in case the projects as sold didn't meet key performance metrics. At the end of the day, everybody walked away from the table happy, and the project wasn't canceled. I have a second international project from a while back, and this one's my bookend. It's on the other end of the scope. In this case, the due diligence effort started literally just a couple weeks before the results of those due diligence efforts were needed for closing, and I'm actually going to leave your imagination to take you to where you think that project might have finished up. So let's wrap things up. We're finishing a little bit early here, but we do have some points to talk about in summary. You really need to start as soon as possible. It's the early start in a due diligence effort that gets rid of last-minute issues, and it allows you to achieve all of the goals and to address all of the risk factors that need to be considered. The second thing, as Josh pointed out, is that you need to make sure that you address the risk of your debt providers. You need to make sure that your scope of your projects has been agreed to by them and that they know exactly what you're going to be working on in this due diligence efforts. You need to make sure that the parties that you're pulling in to do the work are acceptable, not just to the debt providers, but to the equity providers as well. And it's really important that you understand that due diligence efforts need to be customized in many cases to be specific to the project. If there's an area where there's more risk than could be considered normal, then you need to bring in specialists, and you need to make sure that those specialists have the capabilities of working with whatever generalists are involved with the overall project scope. And then finally, you need to get organized. Your project data room could have several generations or several revisions of documents in them, and you need to move those out of the way. It's fine for you to have them from a historical perspective, but your review is going to be much deeper or much more cost effective if you only have the documentation that's there that needs to be looked at. With that, I have a parting thought. Due diligence can identify the business opportunities to pursue, but it's also critical to understand that it can eliminate some bad investments that you really need to avoid. With that, we'll turn it over to Lisa. I believe she has a couple questions that we can look at.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you, Josh. We do have quite a long list of questions coming in, so we're going to take a few minutes to answer a couple of them. And I'll just remind you that we will send up a follow-up Q&A from the questions that we're not able to get to today. So first question is, can you do the portfolio analysis on solar projects in addition to wind? And Brian, can you take that question, please?
Sure. Yeah, I should have pointed that out when we were on the slide when we were talking about portfolio benefits and analysis, that it's not something specific to wind, that it is something that we can do for both wind or solar projects.
Great. Next question. You talk a lot about the dangers of overestimating the energy production for a project. Can you explain what happens if you underestimate it? And I think I'll give that one to Josh.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. We fight to really find the most accurate energy number moving forward. Obviously, if the resource is higher than expected, it's much better for the project long term than it would be if the resource was lower. Certainly, more energy isn't going to put the same stressors on the life of the project that, say, less energy would. But again, we maintain the most accurate energy number possible is the number you want to move forward with. You can imagine some scenarios. If you see over a sustained period that the energy number is higher than you thought it was going to be, that means that if you had that higher number earlier, perhaps you could have secured more debt at the start of the project. And if you have more debt, it means that you wouldn't have had to put up as much equity. Therefore, that capital that you used to put up for equity, you could have used elsewhere, like for other projects. So our stance is always the correct energy number is the one that you want to use when you're budgeting for your project.
Great. Thanks, Josh. We'll take one more question, and that is another solar one. Can you do operational EPRs for solar?
Oh, yes, of course. The technology exists. We do these assessments for both wind and solar. So if you have some, and I'm sure that the reason the question was asked is there must be a project that's out there. They have different amounts of data that are required, and if there is a concern as to what's required, because I might have mentioned some different requirements for the wind, just let us know, and we'd be happy to work you through how to conduct the evaluation for that.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Josh and Brian. I think that's a good point to wrap things up. So on behalf of AWS Truepower, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. If you have additional questions about any of the material presented, we encourage you to contact us. And don't forget, we'll be sending out a link to the presentation. So that concludes our webinar for today. We appreciate your time and have a great day. Thank you.